Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Seconds Out Live. Great to have you all here in the chat, and hopefully, you'll be contributing to your opinions on another big week in boxing, looking backwards and forward to a big fight with Josh Taylor heading up to welterweight. I think I'm somewhere near welterweight, maybe in my dreams. I shed a few more pounds, but that's a good fight that's happening over in Glasgow, Scotland. But of course, Seconds Out Live isn't dependent on just myself. We have a co-host. Usually, I'd say special guest, but he's rather ordinary. It's Danny Gilfillan this time joining me for Danny Flexen's absence. I'm sure Danny will be back in the near future. Danny, how you doing?
Oh, good, mate. Is that the sound of a barrel being scraped somewhere? I can hear a big shoes to fill with Mr. Flexen. Similar in name only, but I will do my best.
You and Flexen are in a short list, a small club of your own, that's for sure. But of course, I said that we need two on the panel, but we also need your contributions in the chat as well, too, in different forms. One with a click of the like button that helps much more than you'd think. One also in a contribution in terms of your questions and anything else, your takes on the boxing as well, too. And if you haven't already, like DB Coupon, who's flagging in the background, he hasn't clicked the subscribe button for many weeks, enjoying Seconds Out Live for free. We can't have that. Make sure you click subscribe if you aren't already subscribed to Seconds Out. With that said, then let's get into this week's boxing action. We look back to the rematch that was Johnny Fisher versus Dave Allen. Controversial circumstances that surrounded the first fight, which led into the rematch, and it was a conclusive ending. No controversy surrounding this one. Johnny Fisher was, it seemed, winning on my scorecard, 4-0 up on the fight. A lot of people ringside were arguing 4-0, 3-1, that sort of thing. But Johnny seemed to be on the back foot and boxing well until Dave Allen was able to close the gap and turned the fight and the tide right on its head, and he finished it and didn't leave any room for any doubt, becoming the victor over Johnny Fisher. Danny, your thoughts on that fight? What did you think of it?
Yeah, I agree with your assessment, Damon. I actually had given Johnny Fisher all four of the first four rounds, although there was a case to be made for Dave for a couple of them, which wasn't the case back in Saudi Arabia. Fisher won the first four rounds convincingly. So, from a Johnny Fisher point of view, you're probably concerned at the success Dave Allen was having early in the fight. There was just nothing on Johnny Fisher's punches to give Dave Allen anything to worry about. He was clearly very concerned about gassing, didn't put any steam on any of his punches, but was allowed Dave to have success. And, by the midway through the fourth round, I was fairly confident Dave was going to win the fight. And yeah, once he had Johnny going, I just actually watched Dave's breakdown on his own channel. And he said, I didn't feel fitter, I didn't feel quicker. I did notice the extra weight, but I felt my timing and sharpness was the things I'd gained from the first fight. And that's why he felt he was able to close the show and closed it in brutal fashion. And going forward, you wonder, what was Johnny Fisher's ceiling before? It's probably less than that now after that knockout, after that first fight. So a lot of thinking to do, a real rebuild needed there if he is to go on to even British title level, you would say. But you have to be happy for Dave Allen. You'll testify to this, Eamon. In boxing, you wouldn't meet anyone with a bad word to say about either of these fellas. But given what's happened in the first fight, the controversy around it, it's hard not to be happy for Dave. And there's going to be some big nights in store for him for sure.
Do you not see any improvements in Johnny Fisher, at least in terms of back foot boxing, something that we don't really attribute to Johnny, who was able to exhibit that in this fight? Of course, it ended in a much brutal and inside the finish distance than the first fight did with Johnny on the front foot. But were you not at least impressed by that he's got that string in his bow?
I didn't see any improvements personally. Even Johnny, I watched an interview, I think it was with IFL after the fight, and he was even saying then, I think the game plan was wrong. I didn't feel comfortable doing going on the back foot. And, Johnny's a naturally athletic kid. He's got that rugby background, so he will have the ability to get up on his toes. But against a fighter with, Dave Allen's an intelligent fighter in that ring, certainly at that level, well beyond the two. And yeah, I think with Johnny, his attributes are his power. He's got quite good hand speed. He's not going to be a back foot fighter. And as I said at the start, I thought he was having more success early in the first fight. I mean, some of the commentary saying that Johnny was landing more and heavier shots on Dave than he was in the first fight. I didn't see that at all. I thought Johnny looked better in the first fight. I'm not sure, what was being worked on in the gym turned someone who's came to the sport as late as Johnny has into someone who's going to be able to outbox Dave Allen in the back foot for 10 rounds. I never thought that was likely. I didn't think that made sense. So Johnny's obviously made massive improvements from when he first came into professional boxing. That goes without saying. But I didn't see any huge steps forward between the first fight between himself and Dave and on Saturday night. No.
Speaking to Jamie Moore in the aftermath and asking him his opinion now that I guess the dust has just started settling on the fight, it was the immediate aftermath of it. And I said to him, from a trainer's perspective, can anyone really turn the tide or the gap of the mountain that they have to climb in terms of experience over in 5 months to make it more of a level playing field? And he kind of said that they didn't think that they would take the rematch. And that's a testament to Johnny Fish and his family and the want to need to silence any doubts as well too, but also maybe a little bit from the team to they maybe should have slowed things down and looked for a different route for Johnny. But I was impressed with the way he spoke afterwards and the way he kind of spoke about, I guess, being a man and having to take this fight. And there was no real other option for him, and he had to kind of stand headstrong in amongst all those doubts. So I thought he spoke really well, focusing on Fisher for the moment, as opposed to when we move over to Dave. Of Fisher's level, what would you do in terms of the rebuild? What path does he have to go through if he wants to get to a British level and further?
It's a tricky one because do you remember when Campbell Hatton had that really contentious decision on the AJ Usyk card, the first fight, and Eddie took him away, boxed him in the smaller shows, really low down and undercards. But boxing in this country is in a different position now, and Johnny Fisher commercially is a different prospect entirely to Campbell Hatton. So with what Eddie's UK stable is, I'm not sure he can afford to do that. Johnny's still going to be one of his big ticket sellers, so I think a rebuild is 100% needed, but you can't afford to be, for too long anyway, boxing him over in America, boxing him in Europe, although they don't really do the European shows anymore, where you're not maximizing on that ticket selling ability that he does have. Maybe Australia, Big John is, I think, a bigger name in Australia than he is here, so potentially a fight against the local Australian could do well, but before too long, he's going to come back to the headline and shows. I mean, he sold what 6,000, 7,000 tickets off his own back the weekend. There's very few fighters in the country who can do that, and a bit of a blessing and a curse for him. I think a rebuild's needed before you even go back in some of the what would be described as area English level fighters. I mean, we talked before privately about a fight between himself and Nick Webb. That's a 50-50 fight for me, and that's one that even needs building towards. And then conversations with about the likes of David Adelaide and Fraser Clark's light years off at this stage, but it's going to be interesting how they manage him. Remember Eddie done an interview, I think, after Campbell Hatton's second loss to Jimmy Joe Flint, where he said, "I'm only interested in fighters who can go on to become world champions." Although I don't think you'll have that same rhetoric for someone who's as big a ticket seller as Johnny. I think there's always going to be opportunities there, that side of things, but they do need to be careful and they do need to, have a real look at things and going forward.
Yeah, that is it. Like you said, the blessing and the curse side. The curse side is you want to move that train as fast as possible and build it and take it wider than just the local area which Johnny serves, and that's giving him the opportunity to take fights over to America. Saw him on the Conor Benn undercard in Vegas, and then Australia, like you said, there maybe has a bigger catchment because of John Fisher's wider appeal on the TikTok and such, creating those comedy bits of content. But also the blessing side of it, now that he's had that defeat, 2 defeats in some people's book, but 1 on the ledger. That means that he still sells tickets, and Eddie, with the stable where it is right now, needs someone to sell tickets, and those in that sort of area in London, which is generally an area which sells sort of well within the boxing world in the UK. You fill it out with local talent like he did this week with George Lillard, Jimmy Sains, Matchroom talent as well that are at the Tony Sims gym. You can still build a good, decent card and keep that train rolling. So I would tend to think that Johnny Fisher would get more chances off the back of it. But like you mentioned there, probably has to be a little bit matched. And I do think as well, outside of the business side of things too, I do feel that Eddie does have I think Eddie gets a bit of a tough time being a bit like cold and calculated and maybe a bit not as well, I say it's maybe soulless in terms of some of his fighters. I think that's a little bit too far, but I do think he does like Johnny Fisher, Percy. So we'll try as much as possible to get him back and earning money where he can. Moving on to Dave Allen, though, he's the one that had his hands raised, and he said, like you mentioned, those interviews, IFL didn't get a chance to speak to him. Unfortunately, Dave would have loved to, but he mentioned that he felt it was very easy for him. He had perforated eardrum, he said, but apart from that, I guess, felt that he'd beaten him before he'd even stepped into the ring. And I think we were saying this off camera as well. We were talking like there's a lot of, even at different levels, and a lot of people like to disparage the levels when it comes to Dave Allen fights or Johnny Fisher fights. But even at this level, the mind games was evident to see throughout the build up. Both were trying to verbally disarm each other and kind of say we're happy to be here in a way, and we're not up to much, and we're never going to get to this level, that level. And you got Mark Tibbs who's talking about it's about the fucking money and all that sort of stuff. All a battle to sort of disarm and say, yeah, we're not up to much here. And then when you get into the ring, you reap those rewards. Didn't really work for Fisher, but always, or at least it did work for Dave Allen. Anyways, he had felt that he'd made that or put that win in his column before they even touched gloves. But Dave did get that win. What does he do next? I put out on social media that I think Joe Joyce might be the type of fight that he gets into. Danny, what do you think?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. The world is Dave Allen's oysters now. Matchroom's latest signing, let us not forget to mention that. Eddie's talking about taking him back to Sheffield and Doncaster, so that'll have eased the pain Eddie I felt from Johnny getting beat, I'm sure. It depends what Dave wants. He's talked about how winning the British title would be a dream. Obviously, we expect that rematch between David Adelaide and Jimmy TKV to take place before that conversation can be had. And the other side, there's going to be big money fights for him beyond traditional British title level. So he's going to decide. And I would get the feeling Dave will take the most financially lucrative fights for him at this stage of his career. Joe Joyce has been mentioned. I saw Derek Chisora mentioned, Dylan White mentioned. Even though all three of those are in the latter stages of their career, to say the least, I still think levels are not something that can be ignored. And I would still have all three a level or two above Dave Allen. Dylan White one's an interesting one potentially only because of where Dylan White's punch resistance might be. Dave Allen, what he is, he's incredibly durable. He's got good ring IQ and he can punch. Dylan White would be superior than him in every aspect bar those three. But the question marks over where his chin are make an interesting fight for me. But yeah, it comes down to what Dave wants. He'll be able to get that British title shot, I'm sure. If he wants that, he'll probably be able to get more financially lucrative fights that he'd be a bigger underdog into if that's the direction he wants to go in. But yeah, from where he was, man, fighting, 4 rounders and Dennis Hobson shows to, in his own words, swallowing it against Fraser Clark, looking by all metrics a finished fighter, to where he is now. Yeah, it arguably you could say his profile has not been higher, so it's gonna be a big fight regardless. Back into this year, I would say.
Dave said on IFL, Chris Lovejoy. You want to see that entertained again?
Dave Allen, Chris Lovejoy.
Mm-hmm.
Did he say that?
Yep.
That would be a good one to get it to headline in Doncaster or Sheffield. I mean, Chris Lovejoy's always someone who's talked a good game and he's never managed to put paid to his words, but I don't see it being a particularly competitive fight, no.
Oh, well, Chris Lovejoy will obviously oppose that opinion. Yeah, I don't know. I think Dave does deserve a big opportunity. Whether Eddie will show that interest in him or look to match him up with one of his prospects and keep the momentum going up on someone he feels has more of a route to the top than Dave Allen does is to be seen. But Dave does, I think, deserve another couple of paydays, another big opportunity. Eddie Hearn has openly said he kind of felt a little bit guilty that he'd not given him the rightful amount that he deserved for fights with Luis Ortiz, Dylan White, and was it Tony Yoka as well too. So he wants to pay him back in kind, and he's got the perfect opportunity to do that right now. And it's a perfect opportunity as well too to jump into the chat as well and see what you guys are thinking. Let me get into those comments. Repetitional says my B. I don't know if that means me or you, but appreciate it. Repetitional. Stephen Butterworth says Bosh. Bosh indeed. Klaus Strife says, was Fisher a hype job? I'll answer this, Danny, before you can jump in. I think that Fisher wasn't a hype job. I think Eddie is pretty much doing his job. I mean, he went a little bit too far. I guess a promoter's job is to stir up the interest and push their talents as much as possible and say they're this and they're that. He was calling Johnny Fisher a world-class prospect. I think that was that put too much of a bar for him to meet. But those weren't Johnny Fisher's words. Those weren't John Fisher's words either. Whenever I spoke to John or Johnny, but particularly Johnny. He's always said that if you can get to British title level, that would be great, and he'd have overachieved and was always humble and grounded about his position in the sport and what he wanted to do. There was never that inflated level of ego from Johnny. I could never have said that. And the other side is that Eddie's got to push his prospects and get people interested. So you do get it, you do understand, but it's a bit of an easy stick to beat Eddie Hearn with, which is a little bit unfair. But also you do have to kind of say that Eddie did push Johnny Fisher and set a highest an unfair standard for Johnny to meet with some of his words in his interviews. What do you think, Danny?
Yeah, I think once you start getting into conversations about Johnny Fisher being a world level prospect, as you mentioned, that is overhyped. So if that's your definition of a hype job, then yes, he is. But as you very correctly said, Johnny Fisher's always been incredibly grounded about what his aspirations in the sport are. He's actually more often than not cooled down the hype. He even said after the Alan Babbitt knockout, that was great, but let's not carried away. That hasn't really done anything for me career wise. John as well, as you correctly alluded to. So hype job's unfair. He's a big ticket seller who's maybe not at the level of most fighters who sell that amount of tickets. Obviously, there are exceptions, but he's not gonna. That's not his fault. He's not gonna say, stop coming to my fights. I'm gonna just, not, maximize the earning potential he has. So, but the world level prospect after knocking out a finished Alan Babbage was probably a step or two far.
Martin Mulligan says, "Good to see you in here, Martin. 22 watching and only one like. Come on, get the likes up. The watchers have gone up as well. I think the likes have shot up too. So appreciate that, Martin, and appreciate your viewership once again. Punk Pop not dead. I kind of think Punk Pop is dead. The rock scene is definitely dead too. So already, Danny, we're at a bad start here. But what about the comment? It was said by some that Dave would get booed on his way to the ring from TV. Sounded like." Cheers. The Johnny Fisher, the Romford Bull Army are very much respectful as well too. They understand the long road that Dave's travelled on, and he got a lot of cheers, and they stayed around and they cheered Dave as well too after they beaten their own man. So fair play and a lot of credit to them as well too. There's a funny moment as well on I called it on IFL where Gareth A. Davis, the Gad, and John Fisher's not now confirmed not brother had got into it about biases and things. If I'll turn your attention to that because that was a very funny interaction. Has Gareth given some interviews since this, Danny? Have you seen any?
No, he was in Talksport studio covering the fight, and him and Adam Catterall done a wee piece reacting to it. They didn't really touch on the pre-fight beef. Gareth was very respectful of Johnny, of course. So if people are looking something juicy, that's not really to turn into.
Scotty says, "Love Dave. We love too. We love Dave too. Even Big Chunga says Danny looks cute today. You feeling cute, Danny?
Always feeling cute, mate. If you don't big up yourself, who else is going to do it? But thank you very much, Big Chungus. Appreciate that.
Feel cute might delete. Stephen Butworth says, "From here at seconds out, congratulations to Dave Allen. We've reached out to Johnny Fisher Sr., but he's I'm not going to finish the rest of that." Zaman Love says, "Fisher getting a lot of credit for taking loss well, as he should do. No one gave any of the genuine smash any credit for taking their beating so well. Fisher was on TV because of his pull, not his skill." I'd say Fisher is on TV because of the tickets he sell, and he does get a lot of interest because of what he does outside of the ring. Skill-wise, I think he's deserved his spot just as much as anyone who's been climbing the ranks and would have had those sort of level fights as a heavyweight. You have a certain amount of learning fights against journeymen where you build up your confidence. You try to diffuse what's in front of you, whether it be a journeyman by knockout shots to the head, the body, moving around the ring, whatever it is. You build your craft and you learn from there. I don't think he's had any extra or real kind of time to develop more so than anyone because of his tickets. Danny, do you feel any different?
Nah, Dave Allen for where he was in his career was a good step. It's just that those learning fights and those lower level fights have been very much highly pushed. They've been headline fights. There's been a lot more of Johnny Fisher on the TV, on Talksport, on YouTube channels than other heavyweights of his level. But he's not had opportunities beyond his level. I don't think in terms of fights necessarily. No.
Okay, Stephen Butler also says, I've spoken to Danny Flex and unfortunately Mark says has been sacked, exclusive, more to follow. Definitely can't confirm that. That's conjecture for sure. Don't even know. I haven't even spoke to Danny Flexen apart from, I think, yesterday, just to sort out the live. So I don't think that's actually come from Danny. But let's be real about this. Boxing is a brutal sport, and sometimes the blame game does get played and the finger gets pointed. So those things do tend to happen. We don't know if that will be the case, but you have to watch the space with those sort of things. And if that happens, it happens. That's the brutal side of the sport. Sometimes, if it doesn't, then they'll look to rebuild together as a team going forward. Jack Dunn on the 45 says, "What do you think about the news that TKO and Dana White will apparently not be involved with Canelo Crawford? A lot of kind of turbulence seems to be going on. Nothing official as to whether Dana is or isn't involved. Turkey seem to really favor Dana White as the lead promoter and looking to branch over into the TKO business, and Dana looking to come into boxing. He'd always teased doing boxing, whether it be with Zuffa Boxing or another entity alongside the UFC, and then try to squeeze boxing into that model. Whether it's the case that right now there's been a falling out, or in the next week they've fallen out and they've re kind of built the relationship, don't know what it is. You don't really truly know right now because of the way the Saudis operate and do business and do deals. They're the playmakers here, and they'll have it whatever way they want. And if it's the case, we'll only find out until I guess the promotion starts. But nothing confirmed, nothing true in terms of any substantiated reports I've seen about that. Unless I've missed anything, Danny, have you seen anything?
Nah, just I saw the news that apparently isn't it Sella will be the lead promoter in Canelo Crawford as opposed to TKO. Aside from that, it's just been pure speculation. I know that UFC have got an event on that weekend as well, potentially the same night now as well with the proposed date change for that. So maybe that's all it is. Maybe there's more to it. Yeah, best not to speculate, I think, isn't it?
Even with Salah being the promoter, that doesn't mean that Dana White isn't involved in any sort of way. Lots
Yeah.
of it could just be a way to push Salah alongside as a promoter, as alongside with Dana White. That all helps everyone. So we'll see. We'll see what the situation is there. Custom System says, I do not think Johnny is a hype job. Got tactics wrong, boxing on the back foot, lead arm like David Price, not boxing to his strengths, punches with no intentions. He's been called Ron for bull for a reason. Yeah, I get that he'd kind of gone against what he usually is, but also in the same vein, excuse me, in the same vein, a boxer, a heavyweight is it would be well versed to learn those different sides to things. Where the proof in the pudding with things is the second time around he's been stopped, when the first time around he got through it, and boxing on the back foot for someone like him who wasn't used to that sort of thing would be a lot more draining. And I remember sitting at ringside. I won't name anyone, but speaking to my fellow colleagues within the industry, he was just asking me. I said to him, "Who do you think is going to win?" They said Johnny Fisher, but I'm incredibly biased. I said, "Who do you think?" I said, "Dave Allen, I think would probably win, probably on points, maybe a late stoppage, something along those lines." Um, and we were scoring the fights through rounds, and he goes, what do you think so far? I said, Johnny's won all the rounds so far, but going to the fifth, this is where he's going to pull it onto him. He goes, oh, well, yeah, that probably is right, but Johnny doesn't seem to be all that. He hasn't put a lot in those last 4 rounds. And I said, I completely disagree. I think he's blowing because of that back foot boxing. And that back foot boxing, whether you're at the highest level or you're at the lowest level, having been in gyms, done a bit of sparring myself, when you're on the back foot, it is proper draining. It proper drains you out, and you get a little bit of a understanding of just how difficult it is when the tide is going against you. So yeah, I think I tend to get the point that Johnny Fisher maybe didn't box to his strengths, but that is something he'll have to address going forward. And if they do end up having a third fight with Dave, Magic 71 says Davis got so much stick from John Fisher. That's Gareth A. Davis, but nobody said a word about Darren Barker, who said exactly the same live on commentary. Can't say I heard the commentary from Darren Barker, so I've not picked up those comments. But Gareth did get a lot of slung his way. Stephen Butterworth says that's conjecture for sure. Punk Pop Did says, how can I take my like back? Well, hopefully we'll get it back from you if I tell you that Punk Pop is indeed not dead. It's undead. Can't be killed. Let me know what bands you do like punk pop wise. Does the Cribs count as punk pop, or is that too late in the game for you? Jack Dutton says apparently Seller will be promoting Crawford. Objection overruled. Ayman showing his lawyer side here with the news of Mark Tibbs. No news. I don't know anything about anything regarding the situation with Mark and Johnny Fisher. Austrian Glover says matchroom propaganda at its finest. Bosch's way to 11-0 against a motley assortment of part-time, genuine for entry-level opponents. Finish was tough to watch. The finish was tough to watch, and I got to say this as well. Thank you for reminding me, Austrian Glover. First of all, again, I don't particularly agree with Bosch and his way to 11-0 against a motley assortment of part-time fighters or whatever it is. I think that's just generally the course for any heavyweight in the UK. That's what they do. And they stepped them up against Babic, who wasn't a heavyweight, sure, and then went to Johnny Fisher. I think it's a normal path of the course when it comes to the heavyweights, and they've just gone a step too far or a couple of steps too far when they fought Dave Allen. Finish was tough to watch. So the way our vantage point was at ringside when Johnny took the punch and then fell to the canvas, he rose up and we could see his back, and you could see his back slump. And when the ref had let him continue, you could also see him slump when he sort of took that step forward. That's an experienced referee in the ring there. I thought he was wrong to let that fight continue. I thought he should have called it off, and he might have got the stick for it. And there might have been calls for, the referee stopped it too early, and Johnny was boxing him well, and he should have been afforded the count. And there was 10 seconds left. I thought he was done. I thought he was completely gone. I thought he took too many shots and a brutal shot at the end of the fight as well. I didn't think it was the correct call from the referee in the ring, but hey ho, that is how it happened. MB says, looked like stamina issue to me. There are a lot of reports about Johnny Fisher being bested, being and trained very well, and was angry about the first fight and put a lot into it. Maybe it's just one of those things where the brightest lights, when they shine as bright as they do, it just affects Johnny a little bit, and that might be something to work on. Don't know that to be the case. That's something I can ask him about, but maybe there was a bit of that. Like I said, back foot boxing, it's a completely different game when you're on the front foot. Is Gad allowed to say Johnny lost this one? Look, it's not that Gareth A. Davis said that he'd lost the fight. The Fishers are contended that they weren't unhappy with anyone that said that Dave had won the fight. What they were unhappy with was the call that it was a disgrace. I put a question into the group chat with us boxing nerds, I guess. And Danny is in it as well too. I said, was it a disgrace to say that Dave Allen beat Johnny Fisher? Was it a disgraceful decision that the judges didn't give it to him? We had a mixed bunch of answers. Danny, what did you think about it?
Yeah, I thought it was close. I had Dave Allen winning the first fight by a round, but I do understand where Gareth's coming from, and that I don't see how you can score the fight to Johnny Fisher despite it being close. I don't know. Narrative that was pushed from Fisher's team, Sam Jones at the time, Eddie Hearn, was it hung on the sixth round, and that they had Johnny winning that round. Johnny Fisher did not win the sixth round in that first fight. So in that sense, I don't see how an experienced judge can award him that round, and as such the fight. Disgrace, it's emotive language, and it's going to rub people involved in the fight up the wrong way. But to Gareth's defense, he never said anything bad about Johnny or the team or anything. It was just the judging, and I did think the judging was really poor in the first fight, I've got to be honest.
Fair enough. There you have it. Someone Love says, sure, it's Eddie's job to promote Fisher, but fans have every right to turn on a fighter. I don't think they've turned on Johnny Fisher, though, especially if they've been built as something they're not. Is fans' opinion only valid when it's positive? No, I get this. I get it completely, and just it's a bit of a double standard in the industry. If you're happily being positive to someone, they're all happy about that. But if you give a criticism, then some things turn. I completely get frustrated sometimes by that double standard. Completely get that and appreciate that point. But it's not on Johnny's. It's not on Johnny Fisher's side. And yeah, also have to accept as well too. A promoter is just gonna promote. That's their job. They have to push and shout as loud as possible and embellish sometimes as to what their talents are, because that's what sells. No one, you can't. In some sort of ways, you might argue, maybe they should say, come and watch Johnny Fisher. He can have a great night of boxing, and he's gonna knock this guy out. And if he doesn't, he's gonna try his best. And you polish that up into the way Eddie sells it a lot better than I have done just there. And it might sell a few more tickets than to say that he's a world class prospect. But it's just jobs and just roles. And when those sort of things happen, you hear it. You ask the boxer about where they feel they are, and if you get a level and grounded answer, you sort of warm to that, and you sort of get that there's just parts that are working in the whole function of boxing, and that's just how it all kind of operates. Whether it's when a boxer sort of buys into that, that's when maybe you can turn a little bit on them. Not me personally, but I mean from a fan's perspective. But I don't really think there should be any ill will towards Johnny, because he's never presented himself as anything more than someone trying their best at the game, seeing where they can get to, and aiming for a British title. Take a look at Nathan Heaney, who in similar circumstances, you can relate to him as being a humble, down to the ground, sells tickets to his local area, gets people behind him, has had a bit more of an amateur background and grounding than Johnny Fisher has. So it's not a like for like, one for one comparison by any means. It won't do any disservice to either person here. But in terms of the aspects of being a favorable or a likable person, selling tickets as well too, a lot of people wouldn't have thought that Nathan Heaney might have ended his career with a British title, but he worked for it. Different divisions as well too, for sure. But he worked for it, and he beat a very good operating Denzel Bentley off nights or whatever. Let's not get into that discussion. But he won in the night, earned his victory, and got it. And sometimes ticket sellers get those opportunities, but Nathan Heaney never presented himself as someone who was a world beater or whatever. He just had a goal in mind. One of those was to fight Chris Eubank Jr. One of those was to win the British title, and he fulfilled it. And he shot for his moon, I guess, or whatever, and landed at one of his goals, and he got it. And that's just the same thing with Johnny Fisher. The words about him being a world class or winning world titles or whatever, no one said that he was going to win world titles, but words of that ilk never came from him. It came more from the promoter, and that's just part of the job. Austrian Glover gives us a thumbs up. Hopefully you've clicked the thumbs up as well too. Stephen Butterworth says update on I'm going to leave these updates from Stephen Butterworth. As Monolith says, Eddie can oversell but can't then get pissy about Backlash. I don't think he has. Has he particularly got pissy about Backlash? I haven't seen anything. I think in a general sense, maybe Eddie has in the past, but I can't pick up things off the top of my head. But I just think it's everyone does love to. I'm not team anyone by any means, but everyone does love to rip on Eddie when a matchroom prospect gets beat. I want to kind of get the stick out and whack him with it. And I don't. I feel like that at this point in time, it's probably not it's not quite apt for me, anyways. Right then, we've discussed Johnny Fisher and Dave Allen. We're going to move on to the next topic. If anyone likes to put any questions about it, sure, we'll get to them as well too. But we'll move on to our next topic, and that is of Tyson Fury. It seems like we're talking about Tyson a lot, and we were over in Budapest. We tried to get some time with Tyson Fury, and I'm not going to do an impression, but he said in no uncertain terms, I'm not doing any more interviews. I'm retired from boxing. And he went on to enjoy the rest of his time in Budapest watching Roman and Tommy continue their professional careers. But we're getting these videos on social medias, 12 rounds banked. Him with his dad, John Fury. We're off to go to meetings. You know what this is about. He's looking trim. He's looking good. It doesn't look like he's ballooned up in any weight and lost kind of track of his fitness. This looks like a guy who was heading towards a conversation about his fighting future. Danny, do you think that's close to being announced?
It does feel like an announcement, an update of substance is a matter of time round the corner. You're 100% right. I think I remarked to you at the time, or someone, when we did see him in Budapest, that yeah, he looks in decent nick. He looks in good shape in the photos he's posting. He's clearly training regularly. He's was spending time with Sugar Hill, who I can't think of any other reason he'd have to be in the UK in terms of his stable, in terms of fighters he's got. So you'd imagine that a fight is looking likely for the end of this year. I mean, we're hearing conflicting reports about this injury that Anthony Joshua's got. He needs surgery, but he's sparring. People have their views on the veracity of that, but it does feel like the Joshua side are waiting for Tyson Fury, despite what Eddie Hearn may say. And I think Tyson's, he's had his months out of the ring. he's always loved the attention. I think it's no coincidence that his big updates and the videos he's dropping are coinciding with, for example, the Alexander Usyk Daniel Dubois 2 press conference. So yeah, I think it does feel like we're getting to the time where an announcement of substance will come soon.
Does anything other than an anti-Joshua fight interest you right now?
Not particularly. No, I know he talked about coming back for a third fight with Alexander Usyk, and Usyk even kept the door open to that. Doesn't do much for me personally. I'm not sure how much it would do for your casual sport fan. Seemed to me more like a negotiation ploy for an Anthony Joshua fight. I think that's maybe what the retirement was as a whole. To be honest, I'm retired, so you have to throw me a few extra million to get me back in the ring. The fight's got to beat the AJ fight, man, at this stage. It's already overcooked, if we're being brutally honest. It's not got to Kell Brook, Amir Khan territories or anything like that. But a couple of years' time, and that's really where we'll be, especially if either man takes another loss or a stoppage defeat, even worse. So for me, it's got to be that fight, be it a 2-fight deal, whatever, but anything else. And I'll struggle to get up for it personally. I obviously don't speak for all fans.
Yeah, he's talked about the Usyk fight. Frank Warren has been very much against a fight between him and Daniel Dubois. The possibility that he fights someone like Joe Parker. They're good friends, but there was at one stage he was a backup opponent if Dylan White fell out of their Wembley date. I mean, the options for someone like Tyson Fury, I imagine he would only be motivated by something at the top of the sport, be it an undisputed or versions of the world titles if they fragment after on the back of the Usyk versus Dubois 2 fight. Alexander Usyk has said he's only interested in a couple more fights in his career, this Dubois fight, and then it being either AJ or Fury. Did he say that he preferred AJ? I can't quite remember what Usyk's words were, but those are the two fights on Alexander Usyk's mind. Tyson probably want that. He probably want Anthony Joshua. He probably want Usyk over Anthony Joshua, considering Usyk holds victories over him. AJ, I think as well too, has got to work himself a little bit in the picture, and that's probably what Tyson Fury will go with off of the back of the defeats that AJ has suffered over Daniel Dubois off the back of his comeback rush of wins up until that point. So we wait to see what Tyson Fury does do and what this does mean. If it's all just a what's the word, a red herring for just a football announcement, or he's going to be playing on the pitch, and it'll be a lot of disappointment. But with John Fury in tow, you'd imagine there'll be a documentary run up and lead up on Netflix to the return to the ring for the defeat to Usyk. Lewis Hart says in the chat, "Hi, hello, Lewis." He also says, "Danny looking swole." Danny, you feeling swole? Everyone says you're looking swole, but they never say if you're feeling swole.
Just a sad reflection on our generation. It's all about image and optics and never what's going on behind my unbelievable physique. But thanks, Lewis. Do appreciate that.
Amen. He's our man. If he can't do it, Danny can. Is this Seb, as in Seb Parkinson? It is indeed Seb Parkinson. Seb, good to see you. Hopefully, see you in or covering a show very soon. I've not seen you for a hot minute, as the youngsters would say. 3D shoulders as well too. We've moved on from 3D. There's now 4D and 5D. I wonder if Lewis can touch and smell them from his vantage point. Eddie Hill says, "Looking well after Turkey, Danny." Is that true? You've been to Turkey recently?
No trips to Turkey. But mate, if this hairline keeps going back, I'm not going to do any pullback. We could only be a couple of years away. So yeah, maybe around the corner.
Oh, right. Speaking of pullbacks, this is hanging on.
Turkey can only do so much of it. Come on.
Well, apparently there's going to be a trip to Turkey for the boxing lot soon, so maybe I'll come back with a fresh set of teeth and hair looking healthy on my head as opposed to what we've got going on here. So moving forward, Punk Pop Not Dead retracted his message, so can't quite see that. Conversation that's going further than what we're going to be discussing here on this episode of Seconds Out Live, but you can see that in the chat. Jack Litton says, "What would he have to do with AJ?" Oh, you're talking about that as well too. Okay. Stephen Butler says, "Now Dave Allen has signed against Matchroom. Should AJ be fed to the White Rhino?" Great fight that. Don't really think AJ would be fed to the White Rhino. Dave did say, I think a couple of years back, he only felt he was a couple of fights away from Anthony Joshua. I still think he's many fights away from Anthony Joshua. but I don't think that would be one that anti-Joshua will be entertaining. He did send out a good message, a really nice message. AJ did about he must have seen the fight and said that Dave had been gambling and was away from the sport and got himself in a better mindset and has come back and applauded him for his victory. So nice words from Anthony Joshua, who was keeping an eye on the heavyweight division. Big Chungus says, "Is Danny single?" Danny, would you like to reveal your personal life?
I'd like to keep it boxing today, even if that's all right.
No problem, Big Chungus. You've been told to keep it to the boxing. Lewis Hart says, "I wish." Um, moving on from Tyson Fury, a lot of interesting comments coming in the chat today. So yeah, next topic of conversation is we've talked about Tyson Fury, who's commanded the biggest and brightest spotlight in all of boxing. We move on to another gentleman who's done the same as well too. Legendary behavior was it called, but from Chris Eubank Senior to Chris Eubank Junior. He has now settled the rivalry between the Eubanks and Benns, which has gone on for generations, with him beating Conor Benn, the son of Nigel. He's also settled whatever it was going on in the background with Frank Warren, who they've released a settlement to say that the defamation lawsuit that Frank had put forward off of the back of Chris Eubank Jr.'s comments during his press conference. He was fighting on the undercard Kamil Zerameta, and he made some comments about promoters being scumbags and making their way through boxing by other means, which we won't get into any further. But the interesting part of that statement, I thought, was Eubank Jr. The statement had said that we're looking forward to a healthier, paraphrasing here, but a better relationship between Eubank Jr. and Frank Warren. Can you see these two working together, having fights between a middleweight with some of Frank Warren's fighters, and maybe even these two working together? Are they like water and Robinson squash, or are these water and oil and they don't mix?
I've never heard that analogy before. Are they Waters and Robinson squash? I mean, it's clear. I can't imagine that this being settled has changed Frank Warren or Chris Eubank Jr.'s opinion of each other on a personal level. Maybe that's me being cynical. I think that the phrasing of working together too. I mean, we're seeing a lot of cross pollination in these Riyadh season shows, and obviously Frank Warren, in terms of the British promoters, got that close relationship with Turkey Al Sheikh, and Eubank will, I would say, for the rest of his fights, the remainder of his career, will want to be on those shows or ones that have that financial equivalent. So he knows that, staying in Frank Warren's good books as much as he can while saving his pride is probably the wise move. In terms of working together, in terms of fights, Hamza Shiraz up at 168 now. If he can get that win over Edgar Berlanga, obviously not a foregone conclusion. He's obviously someone who's been well backed by Riyadh season, a personal favourite of Turkey Al Sheikh. So if Eubank wants a fight in Saudi, it would have to be next year, you would say. That's on the radar. But I think I wouldn't read too much into the working together soon. I don't think we're going to see an announcement with Frank Warren and Chris Eubank Jr. smiling, handshaking, announcing a multi-fight deal anytime soon.
A statement set out by lawyers does a lot of heavy lifting and makes it appear like a bed of roses, doesn't it? No, I don't think so. I think Eubank will probably be feeling a little bit of his bank account being a little bit lighter, and the two obviously then shaking hands going forward. So I might see the end to any comments going back and forth between the two of them. But maybe fights. I don't know. Shiraz. He sort of kind of mentioned that he didn't really know Shiraz, but it might have been one of those fights that he'd labeled as a sexy fight. I think a lot has to happen for that fight to take place. Both of those have got Canelo in their sights, with Shiraz lining up a win over Belanga from his perspective to put him in the midst for Canelo fight. Certainly that was the rhetoric before he fought Carlos Adames, and you get the feeling that that's the direction wants to go with Riyadh season and the matchmaking to facilitate that fight. And the prospect that Canelo Alvarez has said that he wants to fight in UK, so he needs a suitable opponent. And right now, you'd think that Eubank Jr. has shunted himself, projected himself right at the top of that list off of the back of a big stadium fight against Conor Benn. But Shiraz will want to do a lot more, and by beating someone who's been in the ring recently with Canelo Alvarez, he'll feel he'll get himself into that UK Canelo sweepstakes. We've got a poll in the chat. And I want to ask you guys, who do you want to see Eubank Jr. fight next? It should say, as opposed to fight night. Vinny, if you could amend that. Maybe that was my copy that was incorrect. However, it should read fight next on a fight night, of course, but fight next, not in the streets, although there was a tape of that many moons ago. And the options are Canelo Alvarez, Conor Benn with two N's. Vinny, what is going on here? And Hamza Shiraz as the three options. Feel free to put out your reasons why in the chat as well too, and any other options you feel we might have missed out on. That poll has ended. You can see in the immediacy of the votes that we'd had, Hamza Shiraz had taken 42% of the lead. It's going to go back up again, and Vinny will put those votes and options up. So do get those up when Vinny does put that in. But those are the options for you as of right now for Eubank and his future, from the future of Chris Eubank Jr. into the future of Harlem Eubank, his cousin. He has a fight date announced and an opponent locked in Manchester. He is taking on Jack Catterall. The Eubank name is hot, 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 according to Danny Gilfillan on a recent ESBR podcast I did see. But is Eubank, Harlem Eubank, that is, hot enough in the ring to overcome Jack Catterall?
He's going to go in as the underdog. Of course, Jack Catterall proven at a much higher level than Harlem Eubank. In saying that, though, Harlem I thought looked good against Tyrone McKenna, albeit maybe not the best version of Tyrone McKenna at that stage of his career. Jack, as I say, he's a fighter who is in need of victory. I think a loss at this stage would be a catastrophe for Jack Catterall up at welterweight. I can see why the fight's happening. You alluded to my thoughts on Eubank name, and I do wonder, would this fight have been made had the Eubank Jr. Benn fight not been such a roaring commercial success, if Chris Eubank Sr., of course, wasn't involved with Harlem Eubank, and if Sr. is involved in the pre-fight build-up, the launch press conference, fight week, then I think this fight could do quite well commercially. I mean, I don't know about you, but in the week or two after Eubank Benn, I couldn't go on to Instagram, Twitter, anything without seeing reels and memes of Chris Eubank Sr. that had, tens of thousands and likes, millions of views. And Matchroom will, of course, be hoping for more viral moments if he is to be involved in the promotion of this fight. In saying that, it's a massive jump up in levels for Harlem Eubank. I think that Catterall at welterweight, maybe not the biggest welterweight. There's been rumours of him struggling at super lightweight for a long time. Although in saying that, I don't think Harlem Eubank really has too much business at welterweight as well, although that does seem to be assumed for the foreseeable future. So I'm expecting Jack Catterall to win the fight on points. I don't think it's a fight Harlem is without a chance in. I don't think it's a fight he won't have success in, but experience and levels of Jack Catterall, I think, will be too much personally.
Yeah, once again, to get those votes up in the poll, it's back up now. Canelo, Benn, and Shiraz for Eubank Jr. Those are the options, or others, just let us know in the chat. When it comes to Harlem Eubank and Jack Catterall, it's a little bit of, I think, almost strange matchmaking as well. I don't think this is a fight that you'd pitch together outside of, like you said, because of the roaring success that the fight between Eubank and Benn had, especially if you can get those in the mix as well too. You wouldn't doubt actually that in the build up, Conor Benn will get into the mix as well too, especially if Eubank Jr. can be drawn into the promotional aspect of things, supporting Harlem Eubank, if they can create some sort of buzz between those two, alongside Nigel being there. If Chris Eubank Sr. is confirming his attendance as well too, I don't think they'll quite have the he's here moment of Eubank Jr. and Benn, but if he is in attendance, and Harlem said he's always supporting him regardless of who's there in the physical, he always supports him. But I think he said that he's going to be there nonetheless. But you've got those elements that can combine again to create a buzz, which will lead to, you think, the ticket sales. And Jack Catterall seems to sell out the AO Arena in Manchester, seems to do well. That Barboza fight as well. No means was it a complete sellout by any means, but what they'd had allocated, it seemed fairly well stocked when it comes to the ticket sales. So Jack seems to sell a bit in the area alongside a healthy undercard, and now added with Harlem Eubank into the mix. It seems for a recipe for a good event. Whether the fight lives up to it, I'm not too sure. The way you felt the fight with Barboza went was Jack Catterall. If he had that little bit more, stepped on the gas a little bit more, he would have been on the winning side of the judges' scorecards, but didn't quite have that. Now, it might have been because of the super lightweight limit. Now jumping up to welterweight, he finds himself maybe a bit more replenished at welterweight, not having to get down to and dropping those last few pounds. By all means, not a big welterweight you'd think, nor is Harlem Eubank. And I asked Harlem what weight does he think he'd kind of be at that welterweight limit. He said he doesn't really care about that sort of thing. He's just expecting the best form of Jack Catterall. And the best form of Jack Catterall is a real puzzle. It's a real puzzle to figure out. It's a real puzzle to beat. And by the time you might have think you've made progress on that puzzle, you're 9 rounds down and looking at the championship end of the fight and against a mountain to climb up. And Harlem, I don't think, has faced that sort of prospect as of yet. Whereas I think Jack Catterall has probably been in the ring with the likes of Harlem before, so it's a tough task, a tough ask for the family Eubank in this one. By no means do I write him off at all, but you'd have to think that Jack Catterall, in terms of the operators he's been in with and the fights he's had so far, you'd have him as a strong favorite going into that fight. But let me jump back into the chat and see what these guys are saying in terms of the options. Try the Young Hearts from Kent, but won't hold that against them. Don't know what that is. Frank did say an apology would end it and money talks as well. We don't know if many money has exchanged. Eddie Hill says, Hearn care less about fighters' safety. To be fair, Barron moved fight to Spain after his fight failed eye test in the UK. Eddie moved fight after Chavez failed VADA tests and hit Connors. I do think that sometimes Eddie does get hit unfairly with that sort of stick. But especially in this instance with the Fisher versus Allen fight. Stephen Butterworth says, I voted Eubank versus Ben Whitaker. Go on, Ben. That was one of those fights that Eubank Jr. had called a sexy fight, but that would be up at light heavyweight. Do you see Eubank moving up to light heavy to take on Ben Whitaker, Danny?
At this stage, you wouldn't think that's one of the biggest fights financially. I know Ben Whitaker's becoming a bit of a name, but the Canelo rematch, or sorry, the Canelo fight, the Ben rematch would dwarf a fight with Ben Whitaker. He'd be a small light heavyweight. Chris Eubank Jr. I think he'll be quite small at super middle. To be honest, I don't see him as this massive middleweight. I think he's just someone who does struggle at the weight. I think he'll be undersized at 168, let alone 175. It's a fight you'd obviously love from a Ben Whitaker perspective. It'd be massive. It would take his profile to a new level in the UK entirely, but it's not one I see happening. I think that weight disparity is too big.
Even after beating Belanga, Zamana Love says, would Hamza still be as big as Eubank? Amount of money Canelo is on Eubank is only opponent. I think it doesn't. We're not talking about the usual standard of money and what would be there and what can be made. We're talking about the Saudis back in this fight. And when it comes to the Saudis back in the fight, I don't think it matters if Hamza Shiraz is as big as Chris Eubank Jr. I think Canelo's been paid what he wants to get paid for it, and he'll fight either of them. I don't think Canelo particularly sees either fighter as ones that could trouble him, at least not right now. I'm saying that from a Canelo perspective as apart from my own, and he'd be welcome to either of them as long as he's paid appropriately for them. So I think the attraction would be more so for a Canelo perspective if it was Shiraz in the ring and Eubank Jr. brings his own eyes to the sport. So he would have that over Hamza, but you can't also underestimate the British Asian community getting behind Hamza Shiraz, and if you add other British Asian fighters into the mix or fighters from that a similar sort of descent as part of the promotion, I think you could sell a lot of tickets from a Shiraz perspective, so he'd have that as well too. But Eubank undoubtedly would be more of a commercial draw and leads the line from that perspective for sure. Stephen Butler says, unfortunately, now the mistake has been fixed. I picked Eubank versus other, and yeah, you mentioned Ben Whitaker, which is a good fight in prospect. Nobody wants to see Eubank versus Catterall. MB's casting a vote that wasn't for a poll that wasn't put up, but we understand that you won't be there in attendance. If we at seconds out don't fall asleep within 3 rounds of Catterall versus Harlem Eubsnge, didn't quite finish your sentence there. Maybe you fell asleep. That was the joke. It will be a huge disappointment, says Stephen Butterworth. Jack Dutton says, why would you have Eubank versus Catterall? It's a question for the matchmakers. Big Duster says Johnny Horse. Right. Punk Bop Not Dead. Are you boys going to cover Izzy's card? I believe Josh Green is going to be in attendance for seconds out to cover the GBM card. Stadium show, doesn't matter who is on the stadium show, always is a little bit different. So fair play to the boys at GBM for facilitating a stadium show and some decent fights on that card as well too. Especially looking forward to Maxi Hughes versus Archie Sharp. I think it's a good fighting prospect. Jack Dutton also offers, is Tio Lopez against Ennis close to being made? Danny, do you know anything on that one?
Not that I've heard, mate. You'd maybe have more England than me, but no, not heard anything on that one.
Not heard anything on that either. I have heard, though, and you guys have heard in the reports in the media, that Manny Pacquiao is going to be returning to the ring against Mario Barrios for the WBC welterweight title. This has caused a stir, I guess, in the boxing industry, especially off the back of the images in Manny Pacquiao's recent exhibition fight over in Japan. Didn't look to be in the best of the shapes that we've seen Manny Pacquiao, not quite shape, but at least form of the heights that he'd reached in his heyday, Manny Pacquiao. But he wants to return, has been elevated into a position where he can fight for the WBC title somewhat completely out of nowhere, which has also caused a little bit of stir as well too. But Manny Pacquiao, nonetheless, is back in professional boxing action. Are you rip roaring and ready to at the edge of your seat to watch the return of the Pac-Man?
No, mate. This does leave a bit of a sour taste. And the way you touched on Manny's exhibition fight in Japan, and he looked like an old fighter in there. He looked like a fighter, doing the rounds in the exhibition circuit to supplement his earnings. You factor out the time out of the ring. Manny's 46. He was well beaten last time by Ordinas Ugas, and that was even a fighter who, even at that time, not amongst the best welterweights in the world, and passed his best himself, albeit not to the extent that Manny was. And Barrios, whilst I do think he's the weakest of the champions at 147 and a pretty weak world champion in general in boxing, I think he'll be too young and too fresh and too big and all the rest of it for Manny Pacquiao at this stage. And a part of me hopes it doesn't happen. Well, all of me hopes it doesn't happen, and a part of me thinks it might not. It just, I can't imagine Manny Pacquiao getting in that ring at this age in a headline world title fight. I just feel like there has to be something in place if it's someone close to Manny to stop it happening. But by all accounts, it is going to happen, and I think it could look quite ugly in there, to be honest.
Especially with like the way that he fought against Jordanis Ugas. You're in against then Mario Barros, who's an all-action come-forward fighter who's looking to facilitate or get to that knockout by pretty much any means necessary. He's not looking to box the way that Ugas fights or boxes. It's a real tough prospect for Manny Pacquiao against Mario Barrios.
Yeah, I mean, I don't rate Barrios that highly. I think a good world level fighter will beat him, but Manny Pacquiao at this stage is certainly not that. And you touched on it, Barrios is, he's high volume, he's long and tall at the weight, and he's got all right feet himself. And at 46 years of age, there's no way, Manny's going to be able to keep up with him. I don't think it would be an incredible win if he must manage to pull it off. It would, go into the echelons with George Foreman's world title win and all the rest of it. But I really struggle to see it. And I'm just confused as to why. I mean, there's no way you would think Manny Pacquiao would need money with money earned to fight Floyd Mayweather, other headline fights, Ricky Hatton, and all the rest of it, and the sponsorship deals that would have accompanied that. And I know, fighters talk about that itch they're unable to scratch, but I can't believe that someone close to him has stopped this from happening, and I'm really bemused as to why it is happening.
Yeah, the only reason I can throw out for it is potentially because Manny's gearing up for another presidential campaign, and those aren't cheap. He wants to run for, I think it's the Senate or presidential, the equivalent of a prime minister over in the Philippines, and you need to drum up interest, spotlight for, and money for your campaign, and that's possibly why. And the thought of a current world champion, WBC champion, no less, in boxing, holding that title and running for a presidential campaign over in a country would be a strong reason to vote for someone alongside, of course, the political side. I don't know the political side of the Philippines at all, but the image that he could present might be something better than just a former retired darling. And he's much more bigger than what I'm simplifying here. I know that when it comes to Manny Pacquiao and people from the Philippines or have family from there, it stops people in the streets. They tune in and make plans around Manny Pacquiao because of the figure and figurehead for the Philippines that he is. But he seems really set on and a desire to lead that country, and that's probably why. And he can roll that dice on that and hope to beat Mario Barris and claim a world title. And if he doesn't, at least at the minimum, he's brought the spotlight onto him and his presidential campaign, and that's probably why he does do it. I don't think it's a lack of money, although those can't be cheap. You'd like to think that Manny has exited the sport, at least, well, he's returning, but he had exited the sport in the whole with a lot of money. But it is also very worrisome when it was that last Ugas fight, and you see, I believe her name's Jinky, isn't it? His wife feeding him the food, and his eyes are just all puffed up, and it doesn't look like he can even open his eyes. And he's been spoon-fed food off of the back of the injuries he's sustained, and you'd imagine a similar sort of thing happening against Barrios, who's a lot more active than Manny Pacquiao has been, and brings a different sort of style to the ring than or Yordenis Ugas does. Moving into the chat for the last time before we close off, and Danny, as is customary for Seconds Out Live, we leave the last word to the guest. So have a think as what you're going to be leading off Seconds Out with as I jump into the chat. They are asking and saying, MB says that GBM card looks good, does look decent in prospect. Stephen Butler says, look forward to Josh Green and Josh Hart getting down to Donny for the huge card by GBM. Exciting times ahead. Exciting indeed, Stephen. You can get on board with that. Zambano also says, is MVP signing all the females good for sport? Talent pool is still shallow, and even being promoted by Paul, opponents are the same, so won't increase appeal that much. Before I come to Danny, I'll say, I think that for broadcasters or prospective broadcasters, the push for the female side of the sports is appealing and is growing momentum and is being featured a lot more than it was maybe 10 years ago, and that's something that broadcasters want to get on board and push. Not only because it's pushing an opportunity, but also it's a lot cheaper as well too. You got to look at all sides of things, and that's just a side and a facet to it than it would be to the men's game, whether it be, for example, football or in boxing. And a lot of it is stated for the boxing side, and the amount of draw anyway. That's for men to men or men to female. The side of things is completely predicated on Maxi Hughes isn't getting paid, or is it? Sorry, let's use Fisher versus Allen example. Fisher and Allen aren't getting paid what Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. got paid, even though they both main evented their respective cards. It's just because of the draws that they are that dictates what they get paid. It's not a gender related issue. But I did speak to a prominent female who had held world titles in the sport, and this was a couple of months back, and they said to me, look, outside of the big names, no one's really interested in female boxing, and that's a sad indictment for someone who is very much at the top of the tree of the sport to be saying that, and that leads to a bit of worry for the health of the female side to boxing when it comes to it. Because if you're not one of those women, if you're not push yourself into that position, then what are you getting paid and what opportunities are for you? But MVP seemed to be swallowing it up and thinking there's an opportunity alongside Jake Paul to push that. Is it good for the sport? I think so, because it seems there's a lot less interest in the UK from. I mean, Eddie set the signals out himself, hasn't he? Like, we're not really investing into women's boxing as much, but we're signing this lady. But he's also saying at the same side, like, it's not really one of our focuses right now. Just brutal as part of the sport. You can't really blame Eddie for that. But that's kind of the feeling surround from the promoters as to what the situation is. Boxer put a lot into female talent, but the same side of the coin, they've also let Savannah Marshall go. So I think it is good for the sport that someone is continuing it on. You just got to hope that the business side makes sense and weighs up the scales. Yeah. Do you feel the same way, Danny?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Firstly, it's fantastic for the female fighters in question. You know, they've obviously had good contractual guarantees from MVP and Jake Paul to sign with them, an American promoter, especially obviously the British fighters we're talking about here. I do wonder, you know, in terms of profitability, how well it'll do if you're Jake Paul and MVP. You know, the likes of Chantel Cameron, Elliot Scott, and they, you know, they've not got the biggest profile in the UK if we're being brutally honest, and you know, in America, that's obviously going to be even more apparent. Some of the matchups in question are good. Being attached to Jake Paul, who's you know one of the most famous people on the planet, knows how to generate attention, knows the social media game, going viral better than anyone else, and that can only be good for the profile of the fighters. But I think the fact that you know Eddie was willing to come out and say that we're not investing in female boxing, it, to be in a position where he feels to say that, you know, that's something that could draw negative flack, could draw, you know, accusations of sexism from certain quarters. And obviously, I'm not accusing any of that by any stretch, but there are people in this world who would do that. And I think that really shows the lack of profitability in female boxing below that top level, below your Taylor Serranos, below your Marshall Shields and stuff like that. So, in terms of it's great PR, it's something that the likes of Netflix, who Jake's had a good relationship with, will love. But in terms of pure profitability for the business, I don't see it being great business, if I'm being honest.
DB Cooper wants to know your business as well too. He says, "Who's this fella? The Diet Coke version of Eamon's other Irish mate, Corby." Corby getting a little shot his way. I did fail actually to properly introduce you at the start of the show, Danny. That's my bad. I would say you're also a prominent reporter within the boxing scene as well too. But don't let me take the words out of your mouth. How would you describe yourself as DB Cooper is asking, Danny?
I would say it's very, very liberal and generous use of the word prominent. We'll just leave it there, I think.
Fair enough. Steven says Pac-Man will need Victor Conte and Manuel already. I'll move on for that one. Lopez seems to think he's got Ennis next, according to reports. We'll wait and see for that one. Nothing official just yet, but a good fighting prospect, I think, there between the two of them. Loved Danny's Adam's apple. What a cutie. You're getting a lot of love here. Josh Hart usually gets. I should read these before I read them out. WBC are a joke, says Eddie Hills. And Emma Dolan should be signed up by someone. Hopefully, Josh Green gets an interview with her soon. I'll ask Josh Green this very same thing. We'll end the poll before we come to Danny's final word, so you can see his Adam's apple move one last time. Where do I get to see more of Danny? Says Big Chungus. Danny, you want to plug your social medias before we close out?
Not after some of these comments, mate.
Fair enough. So yeah, the end of the poll is as follows: Who do you want to see Eubank Jr. fight next? Shiraz, 41% of the votes. Conor Benn with 35% of the votes, and Canelo with 23% of the votes. There you go. A lot of people do want to see the Eubank Jr. versus Shiraz fight, maybe because it might be a better watch than the other two options. We'll wait and see for that one. DB Cooper once says, "Oh yes, Danny, the man who Eamon always says he spanks in sparring. We need a live stream brawl to prove it." I don't just say it, I do it as well. And Danny bears the mark sometimes of those spars. But, you know, we have to sometimes punish the handsome if they try and overstep their mark in the sparring. It just happens that way, doesn't it? Danny. But Danny, you got the final word. Seconds Out Live, you made another appearance. You can notch that up on one of your badges as well too. It's not quite the Blue Peter badge, but it's something to strive for and achieve. Not quite a British title either, but you got the final word on Seconds Out Live. What would you like to close off with?
Yeah, great to be on again. Obviously, the real Seconds Out Live viewers will know it's not my first appearance. Way back in the day, I featured with, I think, Eamon once, with Danny once, and it's great to see what you lads have done with the show, taking it to astronomical heights. Appreciate the love, comments, the strange ones, all good, all engagement, and yeah, appreciate it and enjoy the rest of your week, folks. It's been great.